Hey everyone, and welcome to the first real lecture discussion here in ethnic politics. This discussion, seeks to look at a broad picture of the American political and cultural spectrum here in the early months of 2021. We are still less than a month out from Biden's inauguration, and we are still trying to figure out, what is to be made of, the remnants of the Trump camp, of the Republican Party, where organizations like QAnon will go, and whether or not the Republican Party's, internal battle for its quote-unquote soul is going to, move more towards the fringe conspiratorial elements or fall back into the more political elite establishment elements, which by themselves, right, embrace a number of fixed and rather definitive ideologies and positions. So this lecture seeks to look at the conceptualization of culture and ethnic identity, and it effectively continues what I introduced to you in the introductory lecture here, but examines some more specific works and studies. So our covered readings for this discussion will be the two introductions by Cornel West in Race Matters, the 25th anniversary edition introduction, along with the original introduction back when it was written in the early 90s. We will continue to look at the introductory chapter of Marc Howard Ross's book, Cultural Contestation in Ethnic Conflict. And then finally, a short but rather important discussion about the so-called two faces of culture in David Laitin's Hegemony in Culture, Politics and Religious Change Among the Yoruba. And you'll notice on the syllabus that I have you read pages 1 through 20 of this chapter, but I definitely especially want you to look at the last 10, pages 11 through 20. This is the real important stuff. So without further ado, right, let's jump right into our material and kind of get a sense of where we are and where we've come from. The current state of affairs of the United States, culture-wise, ethnic-wise, political-wise, in February 2021 is, well, I wish I could say that I was a bit more optimistic. I wish I could say that I had some good news here. But the United States has been for a very, very long time. But I think that it is now obvious to most people that culture is contested in this country, right? We see that the United States is home to cultural contestation in what I call a deeply divided society, right? A divided society living within an era of economic uncertainty and socio-political formlessness. Now, this is a nice overarching assessment of the country here, but there's some key words that are important to bring out. Deeply divided society and socio-political formlessness. And I think that the two have some relationship with each other. And the idea of formlessness is something that I can connect to the late 19th, early 20th century writings of the Italian anarchist Antonio Gramsci. And one of the things that he wrote about when he was assessing the politics of Italy at the time is this idea of an interregnum, right? And for those of you who've had me before, you know that I love to use this term, interregnum, because I think the United States has been in a state of interregnum definitely since 2016. But one can even, roll the clock back about 8 years earlier to about 2008, 2009, with the big economic recession that was hit. The idea of an interregnum is a period in which the so-called old order has lost its hegemonic authority over society, while a new order has yet to take shape. Now, what do I mean by this? When we say old order, we mean sort of the old ways of doing things, the old ways of understanding how, the world around us just operates, right? Sort of this hegemonic cultural political discourse that we don't really realize we follow. We just kind of understand that, ways of understanding the world, ways of seeing logic in things have just largely been shaped by these assumptions. And what old order is that? It's the idea of neoliberalism. Right? Neoliberalism was, I think, the paramount socio-political culture that defined U.S. political society, civil society, cultural society, I would say since the early 1980s. This idea of free market fundamentalism as a way of solving as many problems as possible, right? Let the market, let capitalism effectively, I don't want to say run your life, but let it be kind of the solution to whatever problems that you have. Economic blight in a neighborhood, gentrify. Problems with, financial issues at home, ask for a raise, get another job. Let's not worry about any kind of welfare state. Let's not talk about the role of government in regulating anything, because the economy will give people the wherewithal to basically find ways of making their lives better. And so that's why I say it's useful to think about 2008, 2009 as a period where this taken for grantedness of neoliberalism started to become seriously scrutinized to the point of, let's say, almost 15 years later, there is a growing consensus within the United States that neoliberalism just doesn't work anymore, that there needs to be some kind of involvement of government, either federal or local government, in handling socioeconomic, socio-political issues that big business, the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks and the Coca-Colas and the Walmarts and the Warren Buffetts really can no longer handle. And the idea is that they probably were never really were tasked with this to begin with, but the idea is that people no longer take this stuff as given. Now, that enough is fine to say, but what new order is going to replace it? Well, we don't know that yet, right? That's the reason why there is this period of ambiguity where people feel like they're just kind of living in uncertainty, a limbo, so to say. There's evidence to suggest that Donald Trump's victory in 2016 was less of a defeat of Hillary Clinton and more so of a public rejection of neoliberalism. Right, because Hillary Clinton definitely represented that old way of thinking. And Trump's policy, right, whatever it was, and, depending upon your viewpoints on the world, right, Trump can, be a visionary or he can be, the harbinger of chaos here. But it's fair enough to say that in 2021, one of the possible new orders is what I like to call the America of Donald Trump. The America of Make America Great Again, the America of sort of exclusionary populism, nativism, and I guess just sort of this irreverent disdain for norms and procedures and things that just simply define how things operated beforehand. Another possible new order is what I like to call the America of Bernie Sanders, which is really the collective embodiment of this renewed sense of political leftism, right? The idea that socialism is now hip among young people. And it's not because they're, nostalgic for communism or the Soviet Union or any of that kind of stuff, right? The idea is, socialism is this idea of taxes go towards public goods and services. Socialism, some type of social welfare state, will address the issues of student debt, of the rising cost of healthcare, of the noted systemic inequalities, not just between people of different ethnicities, but people of different social classes as well. And then finally, we have the America of Joe Biden, right? And I'm being euphemistic in all three of these because I want to just kind of encapsulate them with, some individual here. But the America of Joe Biden is the America that wants to just simply restore the status quo as much as possible. The America of Joe Biden is, hey, what's wrong with neoliberalism, right? People make money, people buy houses, and hey, it was great under Obama or Bill Clinton, right? Why do you want to get rid of that? Right? Biden's whole policy is, if he can help it, to try to bring, build back better, which is one of the dumbest mottos that I've ever heard. But it's effectively a way of restoring America, resetting America to just before Trump came into power. So as far as the America of Joe Biden, Trump is an anomaly that needs to be expelled from American political discourse. And as soon as we kind of get rid of the fringe crazies on the Trump side, the Sanders side, and whatever, and we just go back to good old-fashioned, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Oprah Winfrey, The View status quo, right, we'll all be better. And the thing is that there are three, I'd say, these three big narratives, these three big, let's say, political, cultural groups that are sort of competing with one another for where the country is going to go. Say what you want about Trump, whether he was a failure or a success, he has left an indelible effect on a segment of American political cultural society. The same thing with Bernie Sanders. And Biden is probably less of a charismatic individual than the other two, but he represents a third understanding of the United States. Okay, and so we look at, right, this understanding of cultural debate in a deeply divided society, but we also need to understand that this sense of formlessness and these political, ethnic, cultural contentions are also happening amid a larger scenario of collective public apathy, malaise, and cynicism. Right? And this is something that West has been noting in his book. So I'm going directly from the 21st anniversary edition of his book, and he notes that there is there's a crisis in the country today. There's a moral crisis. There's a political crisis. There's a mental crisis. One would even go so far as to say, where the United States is unfortunately defined by three unpopular symptoms. The first, the normalization of mendacity and the naturalization of criminality. Now, what does he mean by this? He's saying that our problems and the causes of those problems, the catalysts, the instigators of our problems are simply accepted as a normal order of things. Right? So we open up the newspaper, we turn on the TV, whatever it is, and we know that there are people in power, it doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans. And we realize that these individuals make decisions that directly affect our lives. Like right now, for instance, there is a big issue as to whether or not we should get a stimulus check of $2,000. Or according to the Biden America, well, you already got 600, so all you need is another 1,400. And it's like really, when it comes to relief money, this is when you're, counting all of your pennies. And what we find even more so now is that there's elements within the Democrat and Republican camp, Joe Manchin on the Democrat, Susan Collins on the Republican side, that's now thinking of saying, well, maybe we should only give stimulus checks to people who make a certain income as opposed to everyone. And that's not saying, okay, the billionaires don't need $2,000 or $1,400 or however much that it is. It's like, if you are making $50,000 or less, you'll get it. If you're making 75, maybe not now. And instead of people like organizing in the streets and saying, what the hell, we just kind of sit there and say, well, that's just the way that it is. We're not happy about it, but what are you going to do? That's Mitch McConnell for you. That's Chuck Schumer. That's Nancy Pelosi, right? That's just on the political side. When we get to, social welfare, when we get to the increased criminality and brutality of police, we went from the early 90s where, Los Angeles erupted in riots over the beating of Rodney King to, it's just that time of the month now, the cops shot another black guy. And we'll have, maybe a silent vigil. We'll hashtag our Facebook profiles, and that's basically it. So in a way, what West is saying is that within this period, we have just kind of become numb to just a number of problems, pandemics, and just general erosion of trust within our system. When we say that's the way that it is versus it shouldn't have to be this way, you kind of have already given up, right? And so we see that there is a culture of, disappointment and withdrawal within the country. Alongside that is an encouragement of callousness and the rewarding of indifference. So in this sense, well-being, and this is part of the whole neoliberal experience here, right? The pursuit of well-being is no longer focused on mental health, or even physical health for that matter, but material health, right? The pursuit of material well-being. This is one of the core principles of neoliberalism. Feeling down, go to Best Buy and get yourself a stereo. Bored at home, go out to dinner, right? You spend money on this stuff. Retail therapy should help you out. Now, this is, again, nothing new. The United States has been defined by this so-called society of the spectacle, certainly since the end of the Second World War. But one could even go as far back as the 1920s, about a century ago, and, point to this idea that material acquisition of goods and knowing that you've got, right, the better car, the bigger refrigerator, you've got the first one, you're on the first one on the block to get a color TV while everyone still has black and white, right? This is a way of feeling like you've accomplished something, right? This is how you measure your life's worth, is in the acquisition of material goods. And so this kind of leads to the third symptom, in which short-term gains and superficial successes replace moral and spiritual dimensions. So our lifestyles are no longer designed around the families we have, the children that we raise, the morals and the principles. And, this doesn't necessarily have to be, one of those conservative evangelical things, right? This is just like, how do you define yourself vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Most of that stuff has been overshadowed by individualistic consumerism, right? So we're not worried about whether or not the neighborhood is going to be sustainable for future generations. There's a Trader Joe's that just opened up. There's, an Amazon distribution center. Hey, that's kind of cool. I can get stuff for free in this sense, right? So everything is, designed around individualistic consumption. And so West is effectively saying that, to this degree of formlessness, political formlessness, American society has become atomized. Right? They've become insulated from one another, and COVID has certainly not helped as well. I mean, this was written before COVID, but you can only imagine we're coming up on almost a year since, we have to wear masks, we can't go places in public. We just feel atomized even further. The idea that the majority of you are taking this class through Zoom also implies a sense of individualism, right? The group collectivity of a classroom environment has been significantly affected by this pandemic and by the rightful, fear that people just simply don't want to get sick. Why? Because we know vaccines are not available. Healthcare is unbelievably expensive. So, even if you get COVID and survive, there's a good chance you're going to go bankrupt, right? So it's just kind of like, for God's sake, why bother getting up in the morning? And, all of these problems are much more systemic than simply blaming it all on Donald Trump or, a small group of, crazy kooky, Republicans. I mean, in many respects, this has been happening, I would say, pretty much since George W. Bush. And one could even go so far as to say that some of the symptoms were already visible in the Reagan period, but, things were still going, relatively well economically. But, we note recession, we note a number of rising problems under George W. Bush. Things kind of sort of plateau under Obama, but let's not beat around the bush here. Obama was not a big fan of, big government helping people out. He was also pretty much a practitioner of this individualistic neoliberalism. So America is going through a transformative age of all of this internal, domestic devolutions, and on the foreign level, on the international level, we are going through what's called imperial meltdown, right? A decline in America's position in the world, as the world is continuously globalizing and interconnecting. It's not that the United States is no longer a global power, far from it, but it's not the only global power. And it's not the only power that the rest of the world listens to. So the United States is trying to reposition itself within an increasing era of multipolarism. The decline of, or I wouldn't say the decline, it's actually on the rise, I'm sorry, but it's just the devastating effects of predatory capitalism. And, while white supremacy has always been a factor within this country, it wasn't up until recently that it became really emboldened, empowered. But white supremacy, and I don't want you to just simply think of the KKK and neo-Nazis or whatever it is, right? But sort of a larger reaction of an impending realization that the United States is very much a multicultural, multi-ethnic society in which whites, specifically WASP whites, no longer have a monopoly on information and no longer call the shots. Now, some of them are taking that realization into far more defensive maneuvers, and that's why we kind of see the Republican Party try to go into defensive mode by saying that they are effectively the party of the angry white voter. Now, all of these things, right, are coming under serious attack, not by any one person or any political movement, but just simply the idea that younger generations are, looking at the country that they are young adults in and realizing, right, that the system is not very favorable for them, right? The system needs to change. And so we're looking not just at ethnic challenges to the system, but class-based challenges. This is something that's also relatively new. We haven't seen this in about 40 to 45 years, where people are no longer challenging the system simply by their skin color, but by their income level, right? So there is kind of a return of collective class consciousness. And, in a way, both Trump and Sanders responded to these symptoms, responded to these problems by providing alternative solutions, alternative ideas to the neoliberal status quo. But that's where their similarities ended. Both approached this decline of a previous hegemonic order with two vastly, vastly different attitudes, right? Now, I have no doubt that Sanders supporters and Trump supporters both wanted to, quote unquote, make America great again. Notice I'm not using the capital letters here to kind of provide the description rather than the motto. But how do we make America great again, right? What do we need to do? For some, we need to empower unions. We need to forgive student debt. We need to pass universal health care. We need to move away from fossil fuels and embrace, things like the Green New Deal and environmental policies to make the world safer for other generations. And for other Americans, we just simply need to build a wall and keep out the Mexicans, right? We just need to show everybody that we are no longer, willing to tolerate bullshit. And, that's just how it's going to be, right? America's going to stand up for itself and play the whole America First card. What I'm describing here, right, are really two different ways of collectively understanding America in the 21st century and its relationship with other countries around the world. And a good way of describing these differences is looking at what is almost about something that happened almost 30 years ago, the Los Angeles riots of April 1992. Riots that began with video footage of 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers beating a black driver, a man by the name of Rodney King. I'm sure that you have heard of the LA riots. I mean, it's all happened before your time here, right? I'm sure the name Rodney King, certainly is a name that you have heard beforehand. The backstory is this: Rodney King was pulled over for drunk driving or whatever it was, right? And by resisting arrest, and we don't know the specifics of what he had done to resist arrest, right? The 4 LAPD officers basically overpowered him, dragged him to the ground, but then proceeded to beat him like relentlessly with their truncheons. And, this is the early 1990s, so, you know how today you get these things where somebody just, whips out a phone and they start recording these things. I mean, somebody actually had a camera close by, and it was, this grainy black and white footage. You can see the images right here. And, of course, this was broadcast, around, news media, whatever. Now, a year later, the 4 cops were acquitted of any kind of wrongdoing, right? Now, this sounds rather familiar to us today, right? Cops basically, brutalize somebody that is black, sometimes even kill them outright, and then, of course, a court acquits them. And, they're rarely are they ever found guilty or sent to jail or whatever it is, right? And, today, we have things like, the Ferguson demonstrations, the Minneapolis ones, right? This was really the first one that was caught on camera, right? It's not like the first time that cops are beating somebody, but it's the first time that we see it on camera. And when there's a sense that there was no justice at all, right? That's when, Los Angeles just kind of erupted, all right? And we saw on news cameras, right? We saw live footage, helicopter footage, right, of stores being looted, cars being overturned, people rioting in the streets. And this kind of created sort of a dual sense of understanding, right, what the LA riots were. For some, it was a race riot, right? For some, it was, the blacks are raging and they are targeting, anybody that's not black, white, Asian, whatever. For others, they see it not so much as a race riot, but as a class rebellion. It was the subjugated rising up against those that dominate, right? The oppressed classes, the downtrodden, the discriminated, or finally have said, we have had sort of enough. And all of this pent-up anger is finally, coming out to the fore. So is it just, an explosion of social rage? The answer depends on who sees it and how one understands it. And, might I also add, where one is coming from, okay? So, Rodney King's beating kind of becomes secondary to the footages of LA effectively in flames for, about 2 or 3 days. And, when riots happen, I mean, you can't really, stop it unless you, send in the police and fire into the crowd here. And, I remember, I was in high school at the time. The official news coverage, on, NBC, CBS, whatever it is, right? They kind of portrayed the riots as unhinged black rage. And it's not that difficult to understand why. One of the most disturbing elements of the LA riots was the video footage of the beating of Reginald Denny. Reginald Denny was a white truck driver who did not know that the riots were happening. He was driving his truck. I think either his CB wasn't working or he just never got wind of it. But the truck came through, a demonstration or whatever it was. And a whole bunch of, African Americans, saw this and stopped the truck, pulled him out of the truck, and proceeded to beat him, on camera. There's a helicopter that was showing this, right? And we're all watching this on TV, and people are absolutely appalled by what they see. They see that there is this innocent poor man that is, being beaten almost within an inch of his life. Now, mind you, right, it's very similar to Rodney King, except in this case, right, Reginald Denny was perceived as completely innocent, right? Rodney King was somebody who was trying to evade arrest and was pulled over for drunk driving, whatever it is, right? The point here is that attacks on Reginald Denny, attacks on Korean-owned businesses, again, people who were just minding their own business, literally minding their own business, now being caught up in this riot, right, creates a number of perceptions that if you tend to be white, suburban, and outside of the area, definitely more middle to upper middle class, I mean, you want the law to come in and establish order. If you are poorer, of an oppressed minority group, you might not condone the riots, but you kind of understand where they're coming from. You kind of realize that, yes, given the circumstances at some point, pressures and discriminatory laws and procedures are going to finally just make people explode, right? You're finally just going to, you've had enough, and you just take your anger out wherever it happens to be, right? So the LA riots are a good example of what we will, and what we're going to be talking about in this class, competing memories between whites and blacks, conservatives and liberals, neoliberals and the left, right? Depending on one's point of view, depending on one's collective behavior, your economic standing, your political viewpoints, whatever they happen to be, right? You're going to look at the riots and you're going to come away with a particular interpretation. Interpretations and understandings that might sometimes disagree and clash with others, right? Blacks were continued to be seen, especially by conservative whites, as problem people, right? This is the reason why cops constantly arrest them. This is the reason why they're scrutinized, because look at what they're doing, right? However, for liberals, and when I say liberal here, I'm talking about, the Bill Clinton liberal, the Nancy Pelosi liberal, the Barack Obama, the Michelle Obama liberal, right? Blacks need to be included and integrated into society, which sounds more inclusive, right? It sounds more inclusive, but in the same way that we say they need to be included in what society? In our society, in white society. So it's not that our society has to somehow change in order to cater to them. They need to kind of, they need to be helped. Let's just put it that way, right? And there's sort of this hidden between the lines description that, if this thing goes on, they're going to be helpless, and that's all that they're going to do is rage, right? Again, for conservatives, right, this is taken one step further. Blacks should be included and integrated, but we cannot just simply, condone violence and misbehavior and all sorts of barbarity all the time, right? They need to be well-behaved, they need to be tamed, they need to be worthy of acceptance, right? And, sort of within the white conservative, the older white conservative group here, that mentality is what I like to call playing the Lionel Jefferson card. Right? Now, this is a reference to a 1970s sitcom called All in the Family. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it, but it's still a brilliant show today. I mean, we're going on 45 plus years since. The show revolves around sort of an older white working class near retiree named Archie Bunker, who lives in Queens. And he's a bigot. Not like an overt racist, but he's from that generation that has a very defensive understanding of minorities, right? For them, the blacks are the colored people, or the Hispanics are, you kind of fill in the slang words here, right? And his wife is kind of nice and a little naive, and his daughter Gloria is from the hippie generation, whatever it happens to be, right? Now their neighbors are the Jeffersons. Now you might remember the show, The Jeffersons, as well. This is where the Jeffersons come from. But they have a son called Lionel, which Archie always liked. Because as far as Archie was concerned, right, Lionel Jefferson was, quote unquote, one of the good ones. The well-mannered, the educated, the well-dressed, the one that's making something for himself. So that's what we say when we say playing the Lionel Jefferson card is, if a if an African American acts a certain way, talks a certain way, behaves a certain way that is commendable, right? Oh, Obama is so well spoken, right? That's what we're commending him on, right? We kind of indirectly acknowledge that this is a virtue of this individual because collectively speaking, the group that he comes from, we expect to not be well spoken, right? Not be well behaved, not be well mannered. So even within the liberal circle, right, the ones that, don't necessarily want to, exclude and segregate, the idea that we have to help them, but we have to do something for them. They themselves are somehow helpless. Even this, West notes, is a way of disregarding any, individual agency that the black community has on their own, right? By themselves, they're incapable. We have to therefore help them. We have to integrate them. That automatically places them, right, as second-class citizens. Thus, and this is where I feel that West really hits it on the nail, right? This is from page 3. To engage in a serious discussion of race in America, we must begin not with the problem of black people, but with the flaws of American society itself. Flaws rooted in historical inequalities and long-standing cultural stereotypes. How we set up the themes for discussing racial issues shapes our perception and response to these issues. And so as long as black people are viewed as them, right, the burden falls on blacks to do all the cultural and moral work necessary for healthy race relations. The implication is that only certain Americans can define what it means to be American, and the rest must simply fit in. So regardless of whether one is conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, what West is saying is that as a whole, the black community of the United States has been systemically, chronically, and perpetually misunderstood, and sometimes even deliberately misunderstood. So in order to get at the heart of why race is such a potent political and social element within this country, it's not just simply saying that certain people have a problem vis-a-vis others, but we need to look at the underlying elements that create these problems. Right? So it's not just that, blacks are just angry people just because it's in their DNA. But there is a reason why the black community collectively feels like they are always going to be second-class citizens, right? No matter what they do. They're just prepared to deal with extra problems that other groups would otherwise not have to deal with. And this isn't even a white versus black thing. Right? You want to bring in, Asians or Latin Americans and others, right? There are ways in which these groups are collectively perceived by others, right? The Asians oftentimes have more positive stereotypes, right? The hardworking Asian, right? The Koreans of the LA riots were sort of seen to be on the side of the whites, right? Business owners defending their, property, defending their inventory from a raging mob. And of course, this adds to the already perceived understanding, Koreans are law-abiding citizens, right? Koreans follow the law, they do what they're told, they keep their head down, they're passive, they're docile, they're not white, but they know their place in this system. Blacks, unfortunately, are perceived to be the people that constantly need to be reminded where they are, right? That's the perception problem right there, where blacks are saying, wait a minute. I didn't want to be in this diminutive position. Sorry for that, right? Like, you're putting me in this subordinate position, and I'm saying I don't want to be. I don't have to be, right? And I don't have to do performance art in order to get your approval that I'm the Lionel Jefferson within your circle of friends. So, this example is a good way of looking a little bit more theoretically at the way in which culture operates and the ways in which culture is used within, let's say, political, elements, circles, models, and so on. Now, this is where I want to move into the reading by David Laitin. And I understand that Laitin is a bit more difficult than West's essays. But there's some important things to take away from here, especially some vocabulary words that we will be using throughout the remainder of the semester. Now, in discussing this so-called two faces of culture, right, you probably got from the reading that Laitin noted that culture is what he calls Janus-faced, right? There's two sides of understanding what culture is. And he dichotomizes culture by looking at it in two ways. The first is what we will just call culture as system, right? Culture as system. Much of this is taken from the earlier writings of Clifford Geertz, specifically his work, The Interpretation of Culture. Now, this is, heavy-duty anthropology material here, but that's why it's important to use in understanding culture for political science purposes. According to Geertz, right, culture is viewed as historically transmitted patterns of meaning embodied in symbols, both tangible and intangible. Okay? So culture is something that is inherited. We are likely to assume that culture is something that we are kind of born into, and the cultural elements of the community that we are born into are held together through what Geertz calls webs of significance, right? Webs of significance that provide an understanding of and access to power, authority, and justice. So in this sense, culture is a collection of ideas, beliefs, values, ethics, principles, and prejudices, right, that one is not only born into, but is largely assumed to be locked into, right, for a means of communication and group association. So culture is pervasive. It is basically, I don't want to say, let's say one's DNA, but it's the collective group's DNA, right? It's how one looks at the world. It's how one makes logic and sense of the world. It's their native language. It's their customs and traditions. And this doesn't necessarily have to be, real anthropological. It could be something that we find even here within the New York metropolitan area, right? The culture as system is the stuff that we are born into that, identifies our traits, our characteristics. They're systems of shared meanings that effectively explain, right, why people do the things that they do. Okay? Now, that probably seems pretty obvious, right? Culture is this, pervasive set of practices that shapes and defines group activities. The other side of culture, and this one is a little bit more on the political science side, although still coined and described by another anthropologist, is what we call culture as practice. Culture as Practice by Abner Cohen, particularly within his work Two-Dimensional Man. Right? Now, both of these works were published in the 60s, so these are well-established, scholarly, elements of research here. But Cohen's understanding of culture is that they might be symbols, like Geertz says, but they are resources, right? These symbols are resources that are manipulated by groups to enhance their power and their authority. So culture is not just something that's just kind of like there, but culture is used as a tool. It's used as a resource, a mechanism, right, for people in power to get what they want, to sway public opinion one way or the other. But it also implies that culture has much more of a human agentic factor. Right? Geertz would have us believe that culture is just kind of there, that everyone in the group just follows, right? Cohen, on the other hand, says even if that's the case, culture and cultural symbols are used by socio-political elites, which means that culture can be malleable and adaptable to current socio-political conditions and agendas. And, from a political science standpoint, Cohen's approach gives us a greater dynamic of culture in the sense that we can see how, according to Cohen, old symbolic forms perform new symbolic functions and new symbolic forms perform old symbolic functions. So what does he mean here? If we were to put this into contemporary examples, right, we could understand, let's say, once again, a group of right-wing Trump supporters marching on Washington, like they did about a month or so ago, with the Confederate flag. Now, does that mean that they are pro-Confederacy? No. But the Confederate flag, which even the term Confederate flag is a symbolic title, because the stars and bars that we constantly think of when we think of the Confederate flag, that's not the actual flag of the Confederacy, but it's just the term that we use to describe, right, Southern white supremacy, Southern Confederacy, and others, right? So are the people that are, at pro-Trump rallies are carrying Confederate flags? I mean, are they in favor of breaking the country up? No. The symbol of that flag has now evolved to embrace larger forms of right-wing white supremacy, right? And we see the Confederate flag, being flown and used not just among KKK members, but among all kinds of, right-wing militias. This is a good example of culture as practice, right? An old symbol performs new symbolic functions. And, new symbolic forms, like let's say, QAnon or Pepe the Frog or whatever it is, right, perform old symbolic functions, right? We know what these newer symbols still connotate, right? They still have some kind of association with exclusionary, rather chauvinistic, xenophobic political behavior. These things existed well before, Pepe the Frog, but Pepe the Frog is just a new symbol that embodies that, right? Or the Kek flag or whatever it happens to be, right? So according to culture as practice, right, culture can be used, reused, and abused. It can be recycled. Narratives can be rewritten. They can be retconned. They can be reattached to things that they were never associated with 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 or so years ago. And so in this case, right, culture as practice channels divergent opinions into one collective whole through symbolic ambiguity. So to keep the subject of the pro-Trump demonstrations in early January, on the table here, it's fair enough to say that everybody that went to Washington and stormed the Capitol that day, they may have had different opinions. Some of them were absolute white supremacists. Others may have just been caught up in the moment by what they listened to on conservative talk radio or Fox News or whatever it was, right? I'm not saying everybody there was ready to kill in the name of white supremacy, but it was certainly there. There's a whole bunch of conspiracy theorists as well. But culture as practice kind of brings them all together through, a few overarching symbols. Trump, Stop the Steal, and a number of, over-the-top, patriotic elements of things that make the people who are there believe that they're defending the Constitution, that they are doing this in defense of the country, not for their own personal, selfish, individualistic needs. Now, the problem with both of these faces is that left to their own devices, they end up creating assumptions that aren't necessarily as accurate as we would like. So if we were to just go with culture as system, right, the whole thing that we were born into it, culture is pervasive, it tends to assume, and we're not blaming Geertz for this, but there have been people after him that kind of, lead us to this conclusion, that culture is unchanging and static, right? Culture is monolithic. So whatever culture that you have today, your parents had it, your grandparents had it, nothing really changes. And, this is where a lot of, unfortunately, policymakers, I have to say, make when they make these arguments that, try to explain parts of the world and why it is the way that it is, and just kind of write it off to, endemic nationalism or ancient hatreds, right? These people, they've been killing each other for thousands and thousands of years, especially when these are non-Western societies. So, in the early 1990s, when Yugoslavia was breaking up into various republics and civil wars were fought between Serbs and Croats and Bosnians and Serbs and Croats and Albanians and Serbs, right? And everybody in the West is kind of scratching their heads and saying, why are they killing each other? A very convenient, although highly inaccurate answer was, well, these people have just hated each other for centuries. And as soon as a strong authoritarian leader is removed, these people are going to go right back to where they were in the Second World War by killing each other because they've hated each other from day one. And we get the same thing when we look at Iraq. In fact, our current president, Joe Biden, was a big supporter of this idea that, Sunnis and Shia and Kurds, they just hate each other. We just need to break the country up and create smaller states in which each one of them has a constituent country or whatever it is, right? This is not only wrong, it's sloppy academia, and it is highly insensitive as well, right? Contemporary works that were looking at Germany shortly after the Second World War were very keen on making the argument, well, why did so many Germans support Adolf Hitler? Well, it had to have been the Germans are just latently anti-Semitic and they're war-prone. Right. Now, decades later, we're able to understand, well, Germans supported Hitler because of extreme economic conditions, political volatility. Doesn't excuse them for that, but there are reasons for Hitler coming to power, as disastrous as they were. These same types of things, as I just mentioned, were, kind of used when trying to figure out why so many Serbs supported Slobodan Milosevic in the 1990s. And we got the same thing. All Serbs are genocidal people. They hate everybody. And we're kind of moving away from that now again. And they're saying, well, the country was falling apart. Uncertainty kind of demobilized a number of different political alternatives. We can't discount the very clear cases of ethnic nationalism and xenophobia coming from different groups, particularly Croats and Albanians. So that might make certain people gravitate towards a more nationalistic character as well. So the problem is, without this backstory, we just tend to think, well, if culture is the way that it is and people are born into it, well, then some groups are, blessed with, progressive cultures and others are forever damned. Again, I don't want to say that this is Geertz himself, but this is unfortunately where a lot of, I think, careless work on the study of culture has, brought us, since the 1990s. What about culture as practice then? Okay, what if we say that culture is man-made, it is manipulated, and it is whatever people in power want it to be? That might be tempting to think, and that might actually help us believe that a lot of groups can kind of get off the hook by, instead of being perpetually guilty of something. The problem with culture as practice, if we take culture as practice to its logical extreme, it risks reducing all cultural preferences within rational decision-making, right? Which means that, if somebody comes to power and they want to use culture to get people to think one way or the other, it's a sort of a case of anything goes. Right? It's an idea that if you're in power, you can just kind of make up things as you go along. And that's not entirely true either, right? The thing is that, people in power, they might be able to manipulate culture, but they have to work within a certain set of familiar symbols, narratives, and truths, right? It's not all utility maximization. Because if that were the case, you'd have to look at, someone like Hitler again and say, well, what was your policy? What was the rationale for the Holocaust? What was the rationale for, ethnic cleansing? What was the rational reason for that? I mean, he may have had one, but is it really, rational in that sense? If we were to, sort of look more closely at, let's say, American political culture, right? You could be campaigning for president during the primaries and you could promise voters whatever it is that you wanted. But if you actually end up getting elected as president, isn't it kind of interesting how you suddenly become very slowly but definitively, another staunch defender of the status quo that nobody really likes? So the idea here is that culture kind of roots us. We can, be a little nuanced, but, it's not going to be where, we elect a new president and next week we've switched over to the metric system, or that we've stopped measuring temperatures in Fahrenheit and be like the rest of the world and go Celsius. There's going to be, I think, resistance to that. I mean, I'm old enough to remember for a very, very brief, and I mean brief moment, in the Carter administration, he had wanted to switch the country over to the metric system, just like everybody else. And about 17 minutes later, he realized that that was just not going to happen because people are like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what a kilogram is. I don't know what Celsius is. If it's 25 Celsius outside, do I wear a coat or not? I don't know. If it's 25 Fahrenheit, yes, wear a coat, wear a hat, wear gloves. 25 Celsius, jacket, coat, t-shirt, I don't know, right? I have no idea what that is. So what we need to effectively do, argues Laitin, is use both faces, right? Both faces complement each other. Culture as system and culture as practice, when worked together, helps us understand cultural preferences and cultural collective action much better, right? Geertz's whole thick descriptions of cultural symbols argues, just as I just mentioned before him, people in power just simply can't make things up. Right? You can't just simply say, vote for me and I will scrap the U.S. Constitution and we'll start all over. Now, for some people, that might actually be necessary, but that is not going to get you elected in this country, right? Culture has to be rooted somewhere, right? It has to be resonant with the masses, and it has to have some, legitimacy in collective identity. So with that understanding, right, socio-political elites might be in a position to, sway public opinion one way or the other, but they are constrained to work within a limited framework of symbols, identities, values, and norms. You got to work with what you have. Okay? And this is an analogy that I like to give when I teach this or in my politics and culture class. I like to use the analogy of the all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet. Okay? So, for instance, let's just say that one class session, we, skip meeting, in the humanities building, and I decide to take you across the street. We're going to go to the DeKalb Market, and just imagine that there is a beautiful, huge, humongous, all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet. And I say, okay, folks, have at it. Grab a plate and take whatever you want, right? What is the likelihood, right? What's the likelihood that everybody in class is going to come back with the same food combination, right? Relatively low. What ends up happening is that what you choose on your plate, right? You're going to have, chicken and broccoli. You can have dumplings. You can have General Tso's chicken. Look, they got a sushi bar over here. Yay. And this is one of those Chinese buffets that even has that mediocre pizza that you wouldn't eat any other place. But because it's there, you're like, ooh, that looks good. I'm going to actually try this mediocre pizza, right? You'll come back on your plate with food on it, right? And effectively, you are the socio-cultural elite. You have decided what goes on your plate, but you're constrained in doing two things. Number one, you have to choose what's there, right? You take what you want and you leave the rest, but you have to choose what the buffet is serving that day. Let's say you wanted wontons and they don't have wontons that day. Guess what? You ain't getting it, right? The second thing is that your choices are also constrained by what you've eaten before and what you like, and what dietary habits you might have. Some of you may fast from certain foods because of religious purposes. Well, guess what? That's already about a third of the food out there. Some of you might be vegetarian. That's another half. So you are constrained by your existing preferences and proclivities. So this is why we might work more with culture as practice for understanding political trends and trying to figure out the role of ethnicity in politics. But as long as we understand that culture has to come from somewhere, this is what I like to say, Geertz is always lurking in the shadows. Geertz is always going to have the last laugh, because Geertz is telling us, yeah, we can be dynamic, we can be nuanced, we can be creative and innovative, but we are working within a previously provided selection of ideas, symbols, and narratives. So culture as system is, in so many words, a study of how symbols and meanings guide political preference. Political preference is really within the vocation of culture as practice, which facilitates collective action of the sharing of symbols and the resulting creation of political legitimacy. So I hope that this quick discussion of culture as system and culture as practice, right, helped flesh out a better way of looking at culture and how culture and ethnicity, right, can be used and, yes, even abused for political purposes. Now, what does this all mean? Right? What does all this stuff mean here? What it means is that the way people collectively think is largely shaped by group identity. Right? This is now moving into the Ross reading, right? Group identity that tells its own stories and frames its own interpretations. This is where we come finally to the critical importance of narrative, right? Group identity, which defines its membership by a number of things. Linguistic identity, racial, religious, socioeconomic, regional, geographic, whatever it is that you want to call it, right? Group identity is defined by something that creates an in-group collection of members and an out-group. Us versus them. We versus they. This group is structured around a narrative, a way of, at least for this lecture, a way of describing the world, a way of explaining things, right? And the narrative is a way in which group identity keeps group cohesion. Okay, we can look at it really, in one very simple way. Where do you get your news from? Do you read right-wing news, left-wing news? Do you just go straight for Associated Press and you don't really care about editorial? You get your news primarily from places that you feel comfortable and that you want to have ideas agree with yours. Surprise, surprise, you're engaging in group identity. And this may be one of the reasons, right? The reasons for ethnic conflict may be institutionally socioeconomic, but they are understood and they are practiced as sociopolitical. So the idea of black rage may be because of decades of institutional discrimination that have left most of them on the fringes of society. But when they voice their anger, and it doesn't even have to be burning things to the ground, it can just simply be an angry speech by Malcolm X, right? Or a rather confrontational set of talking points by Cornel West, or Al Sharpton, or anyone for that matter, right? If the outgroup member perceives this as just another angry black who feels that they deserve certain things, rather than understanding the long list of grievances that go into that speech, that go into that narrative, misperceptions are going to happen. That's where the socio-political comes in, right? And the socio-political comes with preset symbols and narratives that groups have. So, the lazy or the violent black versus the law-abiding white versus the hard-working Asian, along with the non-assimilating Hispanic, right? We always think, the Hispanics, they don't want to assimilate. They constantly speak Spanish. They speak their own language. Well, in many cases, they're the latest wave of immigrants to come. So it stands to reason, right, that the language is still going to be primarily spoken within an immigrant household. People tend to forget, about 100 years ago, among many, many, many Italian families, right, Italian was still the primary language spoken at home and among various other Italians in the streets. So when people are complaining that there are areas of New York today that no one hears English, that's been going on since the days of Peter Stuyvesant, right? That's been going on since the days of New Amsterdam, where you'll go into neighborhoods, these people here are speaking English, German, these ones are speaking Gaelic, these are speaking French, these are speaking Greek. It's like, where is my country? Same thing. Same thing is happening now. And these ideas, these narratives, these grievances, right, they're all reinforced through political institutions and organizations. So the Democratic Party has its narrative. The Republicans have their ways of looking at the world. The progressives have alternative views to both Democrats and Republicans. Populists just like to get real creative, especially national populists, and, really accentuate the us versus them. And look, many of this is reinforced through politicized media, right? You know that Fox is going to report on something very different from that of CNN or MSNBC for that matter. And at this stage of the game, hey, Fox News is not right-wing enough for you. You got Newsmax, you got OAM. MSNBC is too cursedly liberal. You've got left-wing media, more so online, right? You've got Jacobin, you've got a number of podcasts, you've got In These Times, you've got The Intercept with Glenn Greenwald, right? Which, and some people are thinking he's now becoming more and more conspiratorial. The way in which we get our news, the way in which we get our information, oftentimes is going to be presented to us within a narrative that we identify as part of that group. And this is where we're going to be going this coming week, right? This lecture really covered the material that we were supposed to have done this past Wednesday. But remember, because of the snow, we're kind of a little bit behind here. But next week, I want to look at the following 3 readings, especially in noting the role of language and meaning in ethnic and cultural identity. We're going to be reading one of the preeminent chapters of Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, Old Languages and New Models. We'll also be reading a short but very important article from Society by Murray Edelman, 1998, Language, Myths, and Rhetoric. And then we will finish off by going into the next chapter of Marc Howard Ross, The Political Psychology of Competing Narratives. And this is where we're going to be headed over the next 2 weeks or so. The role of narrative, how a narrative is created, how they are reinforced by constant events happening around the world, and how these narratives shape and differentiate one group from the next. So I hope that you find this stuff to be exciting. I hope that the material that I covered today in the lecture wasn't too specific here, but it's really a way of looking at the microanalytics of culture, cultural preferences, and cultural attitudes and beliefs. We take that into next week by looking at the role of language and how language forms narratives, and I think that we are going to be in great shape once we start looking at specific case studies. So enjoy the rest of the weekend. Wait for the next lecture, which I will also upload to YouTube in the next coming days. And I look forward to seeing all of you in class next Wednesday. Take care, everyone.